Hello everyone, I'm Lality Clay and I'm Director of Education and Talent at London and Partners. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the next episode of London Conversations, in which we explore the findings of futurologist Shivvy Jervis on the future of learning. Shivvy is a futurologist whose work examines those remarkable innovations and mindsets that will influence the future of work, business and society. She focuses not just on technology, but also on the breakthroughs from science, from psychology, from sociology. And she's a well-known broadcaster who's reached many millions of people through her broadcasts and podcasts. She's also the founder of the ambitious forecasting lab Futurescape 248, which really brings together this intersection between technology, science and sociology. Welcome, Shivvy. It's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Lality, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to a great healthy bout of forecasting and dialogue.
The term social innovation futurologist, that's not one I'd come across before. Can you give us a bit of context about what that involves and the kind of things that excite you about the work that you're doing?
Absolutely. So Lality, I'll give you just a small bit of background or context on and where this kind of took root. So I started as a freelance broadcast journalist with Reuters and CNN Asia, reporting on human interest stories, and then ended up covering a lot to do with business and technology. And then ended up spending some time at a business intelligence firm and also a global telco, seeing firsthand from the inside how digital innovation, right from the Internet of Things to AI to new next generation cybersecurity, open source data, were being used by governments, organizations, and citizens, and creating not just business impact, but wider societal impact as well. And this sort of lit my fire. I then ended up sort of being given the avatar or role of futurologist, which admittedly is an unusual profession. And what this really involves is I focus on examining thousands of new developments the world over. Indeed, I was traveling heavily pre-COVID, but you can do a lot of this virtually as well, and distilling down to which ones will have true sustainable value. What forecasting really calls for is a great deal of research and analysis, actually. It's quite geeky. I examine market forces, economic conditions, wider factors, inputs from other experts, and more. And then I have to sort of bring it all into one timeline and then make very informed projections for 2, 5, 10, even 20 years from now. And in terms of themes, I hone in on those advances that stand to impact every aspect of our lives so that it has that relevance, our health, our education and learning, financial security, things like that. So this is purposeful innovation. And no matter where the advance comes from, science, tech, sociology, neuroscience, behavioral psychology, and I study all of these, without sustainable impact, we'll be going fast, sure, but will we actually be going where we need to? That's the question I keep asking myself. It's sort of the litmus test for me, really.
That's fascinating. And I'm particularly interested in what you just touched on there about learning. Because when we think about learning, I think the natural thing is to think about education, that formal stage of our life. But I think there are many wider contexts which you can tell us about.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. So as adults, I think we're understandably viewing education as something that's sort of contained within our schooling and university years. And indeed, there's a finding from Goldman Sachs, I believe, that shows that over 70% of education spending in our lifetime tends to be allocated only to the first 20 years of our lives. These are our foundational years, of course. But if we start to see learning or education as a one-off event before you jump from uni or to your first job or between jobs, it isn't really going to help keep us employable in a digital and increasingly automated ecosystem. So this then calls for a shift in mentality for us to be open to lifelong learning. And what we mean by this is for even the most seasoned senior manager in their late 40s or 50s, for instance, being really receptive to consistently acquiring skills on the job, rather than thinking, okay, my learning formats are just a 2-hour module once a year, initiated by HR, and that's it, which is quite common. And then what does learning actually look like? Many of us still think of it as a formal degree, and that makes sense. or of course, other kind of short courses that constitute learning. But this is also shifting, and I think this is much needed. The active learning doesn't always present itself in the shape of an official module or training course, as important as those are. And I think what I would say is, who is to say that someone who has watched a 10-part educational YouTube series about a particular subject has actually absorbed or learned less than someone that's formally enrolled in a 6-month course at a particular institution, when both cover exactly the same theme. So I think we learn uniquely. We each have a unique way of learning, and from different mediums as well. And then lastly, our trajectories itself will start to look different, non-linear pathways, which I'll elaborate upon later. So allowing us to dip in and out of learning rather than having a if this, then that scenario where it's just you first do this and then this and then this. And we've just got to make this far more creative.
And a lot of that will be driven by technology, won't it? Could you talk us through 2 or 3 emerging applications of technology which will enable that or catalyze that?
Absolutely. So picking up from that, Lalaji, I would say the transfer of knowledge really is the way that I tend to look at what we mean by learning, and also how our brains will actually absorb this. And that's where I study neuroscience quite deeply. How are our brains wired to actually receive this information? And I do think both the actual active transfer of knowledge from me to you, the medium, as well as the actual absorption of that knowledge, the retention and the comprehension of it, could be boosted by some emerging advances. Now, these are applications that aren't mainstream just yet, and that's exactly as a futurologist what I focus on. And the 3 that are on my radar at the moment are emotionally aware artificial intelligence systems, adaptive personalized learning systems, and something incredibly unique called the web of touch.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? And I keep thinking about how that might help us with our human relationships as well. That if you're a long way from your family, to be able to squeeze the hand of your elderly parents, something like that. Amazing, amazing stuff. Just thinking about London in particular, because obviously that's very close to the hearts of everyone who works at London and Partners. London is regarded as a global centre of learning, and the edtech sector in particular has experienced amazing growth even during these pandemic times. What is it about London, do you think, that makes it such a centre for edtech?
What does London not have? I've been here for about 14 years, and prior to that, I was in Montreal, in Denmark, and in India, where I grew up. And I have to say, I stayed on, right? It's incredibly multicultural. There is, I think, a very healthy ecosystem for startups in particular here. So it's a very enabling, catalyzing environment. It's home to 4 of the world's top 50 universities, which provide research and collaboration opportunities for growth at this stage. London tracks consistently in the top 3. In fact, it's been second in the last report, standing only second to Silicon Valley in the global startup ecosystem report for 2020. All of these factors make it one of the world's most favorable breeding grounds for can-do founders, who then often go on to create a successful story. I think particularly in edtech, there are some fantastic companies here worth watching. Startups like Satchel, a bespoke learning platform that allow you to mix and match particular apps to meet your school's individual needs. Firefly, that gives teachers and students access to school information, not just online, but out of the classroom, which is critical. Lingumi, that teaches English to kids aged 2 to 6 in a very, very clever way. And certainly a lot of augmented reality startups that allow you to overlay digital content or experience onto your real world, allowing a grown-up, for example, to examine some sort of fascinating topic they're looking into, or a younger person to actually see the solar system through their device, appear as though it was sat on their living room table or in the classroom. And there's also a company called Century Tech, an intervention tool that, similar to adaptive learning systems that I was mentioning earlier, understands each student's individual strengths and tries to tailor the learning content to them dynamically. So Lalaji, with this ecosystem, I think, of constant innovation, these companies also then have easy access to incubators that specialize in ed tech, of which there are many. In particular, UCL Educate really stands out for me. It's a pioneering research accelerator. And lastly, London appears to have a very progressive, forward-thinking approach, in my view. I was traveling 6 times a month pre-COVID, and so I have the luxury of being able to examine ecosystems in varied parts of the world, and there is no city like London in terms of a fertile breeding ground for an enterprising individual and the real mavericks as well.
That's great to hear. And there's a sort of magic, isn't there, when all those aspects come together and they strike sparks in a way that nothing else can do it. And that actually brings me on to another point I wanted to ask you about, that we learn for all sorts of reasons. We learn for our own pleasure. We learn to increase our awareness of the world around us, all kinds of things. But fundamentally, we're learning also to make ourselves employable. When we think about skills of the future, what sort of things would we do well to keep in mind in order to stay employable?
So there are 3 prime considerations here when it comes to skills of the future. And Lalaji, I often say in my talks, it isn't about being future-proof, it's just about being future-ready, really, because there is no such thing as being future-proof. The first consideration, I think, is to bear in mind the jobs that are slowly coming up in the horizon, that don't necessarily fully exist yet in a formal state, and actually keeping that on your radar, particularly, for example, for our children, or for someone, for example, watching this that is 19 or 25, or frankly, even someone who's in their 40s or 50s that really wants to understand how they can pivot to a new career and stay employable. So how can we educate our youth, upskill our adults, build an engaged workforce? What will it take to prepare citizens for the jobs that may be niche now, but will actually become intrinsic to the way we do business in the next 5 or 10 years? So this pace of change is accelerating. And I think many of us have seen this or heard of this finding from the World Economic Forum that says, up to as many as 60% of children that are currently in their first year of primary education as we speak may actually end up working in a job role that doesn't exist just yet. So I think the kind of new roles that we anticipated that will come into play are things like, for example, a data ethicist or a tech ethicist. This is a role based around the ethical and moral use of data within an organization. And I think this will become fundamental to maintaining consumer trust and confidence. And indeed, I've actually already advised a particular global brand to think about hiring a data ethicist, and that's the first time they've sort of advertised for it. A few others that are a bit unusual. I've picked out the most unusual ones from my big vat of research, and it's a human-robot interaction counselor. Someone that will actually specialize in being that interface to be able to mediate, not mediate in the sense of a dispute, but to be able to actually help people work well with AI systems. Another is a genetic counselor, something that you do see now, but it's on the rise. When you see those of us who want to understand, for example, what our genetic architecture actually means for our future health. An alternative energy expert, as we hopefully start to migrate towards achieving, sort of a net impact that's healthy in the environment and mitigating the very dangerous impacts of climate change. And an immersive reality coordinator, someone that will be responsible for looking at their organization or their own business and thinking, how can I bring in tools like augmented reality and mixed reality to allow us to learn better and really retain that information? So that's sort of one consideration. I think the next one, which I'll go through quite quickly, is the mighty task of skilling, upskilling, and reskilling. And often, Lalaji, upskilling and reskilling is used quite interchangeably, but they are a little different. So upskilling implies teaching someone an additional valuable ability in order to expand their role. Reskilling is where we teach someone, either an existing employee or an unemployed person, the skills to actually change their role completely, redeploying their talents elsewhere. So what does this mean for those in the world of work? Well, whilst we're learning at work, efficiency is a huge motivator because time is seen as quite literally being money. And so we will see a shift towards employers themselves, organizations, right from governments to SMEs to the larger multinationals, setting aside not just time, but space and money for employee retraining and upskilling within the workplace in order to retain talent, to keep people in jobs. It is easier and cheaper to retain an employee than to hire a new one, especially as far as onboarding is concerned and many other factors. And it's a superior method of staff attraction. But crucially, it's, I think, a social responsibility, really.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Because we all have to stay productive, stay engaged, stay part of our world.
Exactly. And Alaji, there's sort of one more thing that struck me, and I think within the context of learning and skills of the future, I think we are also going to see a transition towards seeing soft skills as just as core a competency as some of the harder, more technical skills. So digital fluency will still be absolutely critical. Just that basic fundamental ability to get under the hood of some of these technologies that we have to work alongside, tech management, so to speak. So these tools that we're going to have in our workplace, and for those of us who work for ourselves, like myself, from wherever you're working from, are powered by artificial intelligence, data science, the Internet of Things. So being able to just have a basic grasp of that will be key. That's what I mean by digital fluency. You don't need to be a coder just to do that. But other skill sets, empathy, people management, persuasion, a certain type of disposition will start to be seen more as core competencies and essential to actually staying human in a digital economy. And this human element is especially important because we absolutely need to counteract and balance out the effects of automation. What automated systems cannot do, and maybe unable to do for decades yet, it's not a bad thing, is replicate those traits and skills that distinguish man from machine: human consciousness, intuition, organic creativity, for instance. I think in all of this, we simply can't ignore the fact that we've got to have human and societal progress almost hand in hand with a surge in this digital economy. And, I straddle both sectors. So I'm a great fan of trying to equalize that and not forsaking one for the other.
Yes, I couldn't agree more that soft skills are real skills. They're not inferior to the harder tech skills. They're just a different skill set, and they need to be cultivated in exactly the same way. Okay. Wow. Shivvy, you have comprehensively blown my mind.
I aim to please. I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you so much for talking to us. I think we really all appreciate your time to tell us a little bit about this extraordinary area. And none of us has a crystal ball, but Shivvy, you've come pretty close, I think. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.